Right, hello! Today we're continuing where we left off last time and examining Act 2 of Secrets of the Obscure. If you somehow found this video first, then here's part 1 that has all the explanations in it. The spoiler warnings for the entirety of the GW2 story obviously still apply. Let's get on with it. I don't want to lose more time than necessary on this because this script is somehow longer than the last one. This video is also going to be structured a little bit differently than the last part because I had very strong feelings about the start of Soto, and I wanted to get those out there, but I can't particularly say the same thing about the middle part, mostly because there's not nearly as much content here. I remember the Cryptus grind over the course of the story being annoying, but it only bothered me half as much the first playthrough, since I needed Master XP anyway. But on the replay, I realized just how much padding there is in this story. There's a whole 3 mandatory open world sections that luckily I can skip over during the replay, though I did have to resort to going to the wiki to read all the dialogue that happens in those open world sections, just in case. You'd think that after one of the biggest complaints about the story all the way back in Heart of Thorns was the mandatory mastery grind, they'd have learned their lesson, but apparently not. Only one of these sections really makes any sense, and that's the one that encourages you, but thankfully doesn't force you, to do the Skywatch Archipelago meta event, which technically speaking is part of the story. The overall reduced amount of scenes, or at least scenes that are worth talking about, does give me the opportunity to talk more generally about concepts such as pacing and story structure that I initially really wanted to examine, but that's hard to do with just the structure of Act 1, and that also introduces all the new characters and the new world building, which I have complaints about, so I had to move this somewhere else. The middle part of Soto suffers from the Act 2 slump. Act 2 is generally considered the hardest to write. In Act 1, you get to introduce all your fun new ideas to the audience, and in Act 3, you get to have all your big payoffs that you've been building towards. In great writing, Act 2 is used to develop the ideas of Act 1 and deepen our connection and understanding to the plot and the world, and very importantly, the characters. In less than great writing, Act 2 just kinda gets you from point A to point B. You may be familiar with this model of the 3-act structure from school, but as most things that are taught in school, this one's a bit outdated. It's mostly present in classic literature as well as theater, the prime material for high school English classes, but modern storytelling tends to look a lot more like this. Now, evaluating the story of Secrets of the Obscure on a 3-act model is difficult because, one, the actual act structure that the game gives you is just straight up a lie. It's based on average playtime, not the actual story structure. And 2, the Soto story is just not over. But based on the rather calm ending, I think it's not unfair to consider this chapter 1 of the Soto story as a full arc in and of itself, much like how the first book in a trilogy still has to be a story that works on its own. So we've already covered all of Act 1 in the last video, but really, if we're taking the model approach, the real story structure, only the prologue and chapter 1 are our actual Act 1. They are the familiar world, they are the world of Tyria as we know it, until at the start of chapter 2 we suddenly get dragged into the realm of dreams, which is our break into Act 2, where we're quite literally being pulled into an unfamiliar world. This rising bit here is also called the Fun and Games section, which, despite the name, neither has to be fun nor contain games. But what it does have to do is deliver on the premise of the story, the reason why you might be interested in picking something up. In Soto's case, this is the second half of Chapter 2 all the way to at least Chapter 5. We meet more of the supporting cast, we learn a bunch of new lore, we fight Cryptus, and just generally go adventuring. All the things that Soto on the surface level promises. Up to here, the story structure generally works. Chapter 4 and 5 don't have that much worth discussing, since they're mostly short dialogue scenes in between a whole bunch of padding. There is 1 or 2 lines I want to talk about, in part because I'm about to launch into a whole lot of big criticism, And these are some positive things I can talk about. And I don't like making wholly negative videos, so yeah, I needed to latch onto something, okay? Starting with Chapter 4, Peifa has a very interesting exchange.
Does that make you angry?
Does what make me angry?
The fact that everyone doesn't immediately bathe in your excellence.
They don't know me. Neither do you.
But I'm starting to. And I don't think you liked that very much.
So this is kind of inconsistent with every version of the commander we've had, both the somewhat more naive version and the experienced veteran that we've seen at various points, both in the Sword of Story and in general. You can read into this that she's detecting feelings that are hidden under the surface, which is something that might be foreshadowing for a later part of the story if we dive back into the commander's psychology a little more. But I also like the idea of interpreting this as a fourth wall break. Not so much on Peifa's part, but on Einet's side, calling out players for dismissing characters that aren't immediately sympathetic to them, or, as we will see later in this discussion, steal the spotlight from them. Which is a big criticism of characters like Traherne. Now, the Traherne storyline has its own problems, mostly just that Traherne is kind of boring, but it's kind of a fun call-out, and yes, I recognize that in the last episode, I had this whole big ramble about Lear and Lear being arrogant towards us, but the point of that wasn't that he's supposed to act different towards us with reverence or anything, it's that that exchange was weirdly one-sided and missed opportunities to further character and world building, which is much more important to me. But, you know, doubling down on the idea that this line is a little bit of a fourth wall break, the very next thing that happens is us meeting Ritchik and Gladium for the first time, which are the Commander fan club of this storyline, directly contrasting Lear and Dagda. Moving on to Chapter 5, this actually gives us some real lore that doesn't contradict anything, which at this point really feels like a lot to ask for. I'm talking about the idea that the magic of the tower is somehow alive or sentient, and that idea is not entirely new. We've seen magic have some level of being to take action. Ley lines are essentially concentrated streams of magic, which is why they were becoming more and more prevalent over the course of the story as we were slaying more dragons, due to all of the uncontrolled magic being released into the world. And then eventually we started seeing leyline creatures and the leyline anomalies. And these being a sentient form of pure magic is very, very interesting. Now, Isgaren, who has a special connection to the tower, seems to be more important in upcoming chapters, and I hope that this idea of sentient magic and Isgaren's connection to it, or the tower in general, is something we'll get to explore more in the upcoming chapters. We'll see if that holds true, but it's something I'd like to see. Something else notable in Chapter 5 is the very first line we hear as we join the instance, with Lear saying,
"My stein is too dry. I can't feel anything at all. The last glimpse was of Cryptis. A whole horde of them."
And perhaps, just maybe, I'm reading too much into this, but I see this line as more than just a haha funny drunken dwarf joke. Though, yes, dwarves being constantly drunk is a thing from all the way back in Guild Wars 1, but I do think this goes a little deeper. The one saying this is only Lear's emotional half. This is before the two halves of him reunite. It's not unreasonable to say that without his logical half, he lacks any emotional regulation ability, worsened by the increased stress of the current emergency situation. So just maybe, he's using substances, in his case alcohol, as a coping mechanism. And there's several other characters, Mabon, Dagda, Isgaren, and Zoja at the very least, that display some sort of behavior that could be the result of trauma or excessive stress and act as coping mechanisms, though for most of them these are social behaviors. This is a type of character analysis that I don't have time to cover here, though another thing I want to call out is that Mabon, Dagda, Isgaren, and Lear make up 4 of the 5 major races that failed to prevent the previous dragon cycle: a Masat, a Jotun, a Seer, and a Dwarf. And all those races in some form then suffered consequences from the dragon cycle, which is why a lot of them are so different to how we know the races in Guild Wars 2. The Jotun are particularly obvious with that one. And I'd be willing to bet real actual money that Akeem, a somewhat mysterious character who died sometime before the start of Soto, was a Forgotten, the last missing in that quintet. Hey, editing Marin here. Turns out there's some ambient dialogue in Amnitas that actually says Akeem was a djinn? However, even in the dialogue, they're not quite sure if this is actually true. So, I don't quite owe anybody real actual money yet. The psychology of the Soto cast and their inbuilt references to othering, neurodivergence, disability, and mental health are something that would need to be its own video to do it justice. And it's actually genuinely quite interesting to look at all of these characters through those lenses. Okay, some positive things out of the way, let's go back to our overall story structure and continue to Chapter 6. And here is where the problems really begin. So ideally, Chapter 6 should be the story's midpoint. This is the big turning point of the story, and it's where Soto's pacing completely falls flat. Normally, this point marks the change in trajectory of the events. If things have been generally going well so far, they're gonna start going wrong. If things have been going terribly so far, they're about to get a lot better. The midpoint is where the big revelation hits that however the characters have been approaching the situation thus far is not nearly as effective as they hoped it would be, which then starts them down a different path to finding the real solution. And said extended path is this downward section. Soto just doesn't have this. You can, in theory, argue that Mabon's death should be the midpoint, as it is a pretty significant event, but it makes way more sense for this to be the big break into Act 3, where for once the in-game and real act structure happen to align. This is because the very next part of the story is preparing for the final assault, one of the most common plot beats early into an Act 3. Chapter 7 also follows that expected downward trajectory that the second half of an Act 2 should follow, considering that generally things have been going well up till now. That only leaves Chapter 6 as the midpoint, which also happens to be the exact middle of the 11 chapters if you include the prologue. And while we have a significant in-universe event here, retaking the tower with the assembled company, there's just no revelations whatsoever. Or I guess there is.
How much longer I can resist them? The whispers are eager. My dear friends, don't fret. We have survived the Elder Dragon.
Oh.
Rogue God.
So this whole cutscene was just him giving us death flags. Okay.
The Cryptis won't be our end. They are vulnerable, ignorant. I only ask one thing of you. When the hour arrives, do not hesitate.
Yeah, that's your big important turning point. A bit of spooky eye glow and some foreshadowing that's not even out of character for Mabon on an average day. This is, quite frankly, pathetic, and I can't call it anything else. And once more, fixing this would have required almost no change to the story. All that needs to happen is that Mabon gets possessed right then and there. just like Dagda had been possessed right before the storm. Then, in a last-ditch effort to protect his allies, just before losing control, he flees to Amnitas. This could have been used to further set up the tragedy of his oncoming demise by either saying or at least implying that the reason he was possessed, instead of anybody else suffering that fate, was because he was the most exposed to the magical burn that he just explained to Zoja moments earlier. The abyss of the world looking back at him, something that, especially in the absence of Isgarin, he is likely to be shouldering the heaviest burden of, being painted as the leader and presumably because of that also the most capable magic user. Or at least presenting it like that would have been real compelling and would have gotten us to the exact same point from here, instead of just him getting attacked off screen, which is just so fantastic. A comment on the previous video listed off a whole bunch of different problems they found with the Soda story, and one of them was that it doesn't really feel like we as the players are needed here. The wizards seem to have everything kind of under control, and I think this is one of the two major reasons as to why. We basically only act as muscle throughout the entire Soda story so far, and contribute very little to the plot. Even when Mabon dies, the cast, aside from Zoja, hardly seems shocked. A bit sad, but not exactly lost on how to proceed. While the situations that we encounter are very much being presented as difficult and troubling, and they appreciate the extra pair of capable hands, nothing that's happening seems to be anything they weren't already prepared to deal with, which makes it feel like they would have solved this problem whether we were there or not. By the way, I really do appreciate people taking the time to not only view these videos, but to engage with them by leaving their ideas in a thought-out manner. I'm always surprised by how many comments I get that feel like they're worth answering or engaging with. I do really appreciate that. And I have to do one more tangent, if you'll excuse me. I also promised that guy I'd talk about Livia. She's really just here as another bit of fanservice, though I don't know who it serves when they bring back a character whose story was concluded and who was originally already only brought back as fanservice the first time round. This is not inherently a problem, I just don't like pandering. But she is also great encapsulations of Soto's completely unnecessary retcons. I don't really have a problem with her being slightly uneasy friends with Mabon. That's character growth on her part, and she's had to be doing something for the past 5-ish years. I do take issue with her knowing Mabon before we met. This is obviously a retcon and just completely unneeded. Here is an alternate backstory. They could have made it so that, after we part, she finds out Mabon exists. Perhaps in her fervent hate for all things White Mantle and Mersat, she regularly uses some type of obscure magic that reveals the fact that there is a living Mersat on Tyria, even for just a brief moment while Mabon visits the place in disguise, which is something they do tell us that he sometimes does. Determined to hunt them down, she eventually ends up finding and attacking Mabon, but he talks her into a ceasefire. Eventually, afterwards, she's recruited, in part because of her impressive magical ability that was required to even find him in the first place. Doesn't that make way more sense and feel way more like these characters have real, actual, continuous lives when we're not looking? Rather than going, oh yeah, actually these two knew each other all along, and I just didn't feel like bringing it up to you. These things have definitely always existed. Trust. Anyway, enough tangents. I have to start speaking about Mabon's death. It's time to talk about Chapter 7. And if the lackluster world building of the Wizard's Court in Act 1 was the most frustrating part of Soto, then this is the most disappointing one. And I'm consciously skipping all the complaints I have about the concepts and design of the bastions, because that's just gratuitous. To talk about Mabon's death, I first have to explain the concept of fridging. If you feel like getting a little deeper into the subject, check out this video by Overly Sarcastic Productions on the topic. Everything they make is fantastic. A 400 subscription channel recommending one of over 2 million feels weird, but it's relevant, and Again, I just like their stuff. Anyway, to summarize the concept, fridging is a term that started on TV tropes referring to the act of killing a character purely for the development of another. It's one of the only completely non-salvageable tropes in existence because its entire premise is a badly executed death. The name originally comes from a particular Green Lantern comic in which the hero's wife is killed off-screen and found dead in a fridge. In its purest form, the character that is killed off is created for literally no other purpose than to die, usually even off-screen, as they don't contribute anything else to the story. Unsurprisingly, this most commonly happens to women. Now, obviously this isn't entirely the case with Mabon, but the main concept still holds. The purpose of Mabon's death is to kick off Zoja's character arc, and that's it. The other characters barely seem to react, and losing him doesn't really cut us off from any plans or options in the following chapters. It's like none of them ever envisioned Mabon even being there for the next stages of the fight. I wonder why. There's really three main ways of writing a satisfying death. One is that it becomes a linchpin of the plot going forward. 2, it marks the end of one's journey. And 3, it's a sudden gut punch. Mabon does none of these things. I've already talked about the first part and how Mabon's death lacks impact on the plot. The second type, the end of the journey, when it's not literally the ending of the story, most often happens to mentor figures, which, while cliché, is very effective. The crucial part of this, however, is not that it's a mentor passing on the torch to another, which does work with Mabon and Zoja. It's that their story was essentially over at the point of their death. Unfortunately, for him, Mabon is quite possibly the single most interesting character in Soto, both from a lore and a personality perspective. His insight as not only an ancient being, but also being the last living Mersat and maybe one of the only defectors from the Mersat doctrine and belief system ever, could have been fascinating. Unfortunately, we're not given any time to examine any of this, and all of that potential is completely thrown out the window the moment he dies. In-universe, he might have lived a long, fulfilling life, but that just does not translate to screen time, and the interactions we have with him are only informed by his perspective as so far that he's a traumatized old guy who's quite wise, but otherwise, that could have been a human with a big white beard, and you'd hardly know the difference. Then what about the third idea, the emotional gut punch? Well, the main components of one of these deaths is that they happen very suddenly, and they provoke an intense emotional reaction. They can have some level of setup, but they need to be surprising. Mabon's death is not only clumsily foreshadowed by the preceding chapter, the title of Chapter 7 is also Mabon's fate. This is the opposite of sudden and also the opposite of subtlety. It's so incredibly obvious, painfully so even, and you can barely overlook it when it is in the top right of your screen the entire time. As for emotional reactions, well, Zoja has one, and that's it. Come on, this is the time to cry, to scream, to have big speeches about how important he was, full of as much pathos as you can muster, not to console a single person like their kid that just lost their first pet. Because that's the energy I'm getting from Dagda over here.
What are you thinking, little light?
I think what Annette was going for was a Type 2 mentor's death. And if the scene itself was better constructed, then it might have at least kind of worked. I think a lot of people, including myself, wouldn't have been happy about it, but at least would have worked. But look at what we have. Mabon is attacked off-screen while we're on a filler mission. Then we fight some large group of Cryptis where almost no dialogue happens, move into one of the most generic-looking places in all of Amnitas, a courtyard with no personal connection to any of the characters that are relevant in this moment, fight a fully generic Cryptis champion that you can pull out of any rift, and then Mabon gets a few lines and keels over with a generic death animation. Seriously?
Seriously?
I'd be screaming if that wouldn't make my audio quality even worse than it is already. Dagda's possession got a whole strike mission to its own, and she ended up walking that off a few minutes later, and Mabon gets this half-assed garbage? This was the time to have a multi-stage boss fight, where in the first half we could have fought a Mersat for real for the first time ever in Guild Wars 2, not just something disguised as a Mersat or an apparition. The end of Season 3 was weird. And then we can dramatically pull the demon out of him and beat that instead. But in the end, we end up being too late anyway. Mabon collapses, sharing his last words of wisdom with all his friends, but subtly speaking to Zoja in particular. We hear Eparg laughing in the distance at the loss of the Wizards Court's leader, an experience we have to keep secret from everyone else, as life fades from the body of one of the only people who treated us as an equal in this unfamiliar place. His body goes limp, and Zoja breaks out into tears, holding him one last time. That is how you write a death scene. Even if it was somehow mandated that we needed a strike mission at an early point in the story, and another unique boss fight was out of the budget, then at the very least, give him a cinematic cutscene to send him off, and make sure that we know who killed him. Even after 2 playthroughs, I didn't realize this guy had a name. Fun fact from the wiki, said name is derived from the ancient Greek word for weak, which is just insult on top of injury. Later, in some side dialogue, it gets brought up by Ceres that apparently this guy was close to him in some capacity. But like, that's it? You could have at least given us some dialogue from the Cryptus we fight moments earlier, taunting us, calling out his name, and boasting about him, to give us some sort of personal connection to this random-ass demon. Anything at all to make this fight itself memorable. Please. Yes, unspectacular deaths can also still be impactful, but that generally only works if the futility of life or the inevitability of death, or both, are core components of the story, the world, or a particular arc, which clearly aren't themes that it was going for here. You can consider a lot of the stuff I talked about in episode 1 pure nitpicking, and that's because I like to nitpick, because I am pedantic. But this was just genuinely poorly written. Anyway, now that I've given you enough hints, it's time for a pop quiz. Who's the main character of Soto? Even in a narrative with multiple central figures, there's always one primary protagonist. I'll give you a moment to figure out your answer. If you said the commander, you're wrong. If you answered Zoja, congrats, you have a basic understanding of story interpretation and can distinguish between a POV character and the protagonist. You can give yourself a pat on the back for that one. If the fact that her face is on the launcher, the background of the wiki, and I think also the banner on the subreddit, if that didn't already make it obvious how important she is, Zoja is also the one that gets the most character development. In fact, she's kind of the only one who gets any character development whatsoever, and the person whose arc reflects the themes of the story the most: mental health, isolation, strong emotions, and growing to become something more than your past. It's another wrinkle in the weirdness of Soto's pacing, because really, Chapter 2 through 7 can be considered Act 1 of Zoja's character arc. The commander's arrival is the inciting incident, and Mabon's death is the thing that eventually pulls her out of her familiar environment. At least, I really hope that's what they're going for, because if that's the case, I can at least kind of excuse some of the weirdness in this story's pacing. Her struggle in choosing between her past and the future that will make her happy is something I expect we'll see play out throughout the rest of the remaining chapters. And one of the 2 fully hard predictions I'm willing to make is that she ends up joining the Astral Ward at the very end of the story, with us getting to know the new Zoja a little bit during the epilogue. It would very cleanly resolve her arc, write her out of the story so she's not a concern for future expansions, deliver on the setup that we see later in this story that I'll talk about at that point, and complete the theme of growth that I just mentioned. On the other hand, the actions of the main villain, Eparch, stemming from his inability to grow past his resentment of being rejected from the wizard's court and his constant hunger for selfish power, is also a perfect mirror to the storyline. It just works. Personally, I don't really mind giving her the spotlight, though this is also the other thing that contributes so heavily to us as the players feeling kind of irrelevant. But the resulting story itself has to be interesting and well executed. But the way it's being handled right now seems to be coming at a detriment to every other character's ability to share their own unique stories and perspectives, which, especially in a cast this large, is not good. Not good at all. At least for this one, there's still time to salvage it. Anyway, that's it for Act 2. This ended up being a lot more negative than I would have liked, but the botched death scene and awkward pacing is something that I just had to talk about. I really hope I can find some more positive things in Act 3. I'm gonna be digging for them, just you wait. Before I finish up, if you have any interest in the techniques of writing and particularly pacing, I can highly recommend the book Save the Cat Writes a Novel. It's fantastic for learning exactly this type of analysis. Anyway, if you stuck until this part, these videos take upwards of 8 hours to make and they barely get any views, so it would be lovely if you could engage, leave a like, maybe subscribe, then you might even see the conclusion of this. And if it's not yet been Friday the 27th at 7 p.m. Central European, then that's when I'm doing the pre-stream for Act 3. So, yeah. Till then, thank you and goodbye.